Our next speaker is Jeremy Lent from San Rafael, California. The title of his talk is The Tyranny of the Prefrontal Cortex.
Hi. And I'd like to ask you all to consider the following facts about the current state of our world. Our civilization is changing the climate of our planet. People kill themselves and others in the name of God. Species are going extinct at a rate not seen for 65 million years. 1 billion people go hungry every day. We make astonishing advances in technology, yet our world is careening ever faster out of control. And meanwhile, people everywhere are searching for spiritual meaning to their lives. What connects these seemingly unrelated phenomena? I'm proposing in this presentation that there is an overriding dynamic driving all these global imbalances. It's so fundamental to our lives that we don't even realize it exists. It's what I call the tyranny of the prefrontal cortex over other aspects of our consciousness. And I've come to believe that acknowledging this tyranny is the first step towards reharmonizing our individual and collective consciousness. In this presentation, you'll see what may be called a cognitive history of humanity. That's a view of human history interpreted from a cognitive perspective. It understands humanity's evolving stages of cultural thought in terms of the prefrontal cortex, or PFC's, ever-increasing power over human consciousness. It identifies certain human cognitive universals emerging in prehistory, and then looks at some cultural-specific cognitive divergences happening in the past 2,500 years. The presentation will be in three parts. First, we'll look at what I mean by the tyranny of the PFC. Then we'll examine how it came about. And finally, we'll take a look at what it means. What are its implications for us and our future? So first, let's just spend a moment on the PFC itself. It's located at the very front of the brain in what's known as the cerebral cortex. It's far more developed in humans than in other animals. And it mediates those parts of our cognition that are uniquely human, such as symbolic thought, conceptualizing, planning, making rules, and creating abstractions. It also is responsible for controlling our physiological drives, for imposing meaning on things, and for allowing us to conceive of a past and a future, and to see ourselves and others as independent agents. Because of the prefrontal cortex, humans are unique in having dual forms of consciousness. A conceptual consciousness, all that stuff mediated by the PFC, and an animate consciousness, that part of our lived experience that we share with other mammals, such as hunger, sexual urges, pain, fear, aggression, desire for warmth, and caring for our offspring. But over the past few thousand years, changes in culture have caused a shift in the balance between these two forms of consciousness, so that it began to look more like this, where conceptual consciousness is elevated over animate consciousness. We think of those PFC-mediated faculties like reason, abstraction, willpower, and transcendence as higher qualities, while those animate functions like primary emotions, instincts, and sexual drive have been relegated to baser instincts. Now, this shift happened over a number of stages in human history, and they were punctuated with some key inflection points that I'll show you in this chart. You'll see the time on the horizontal axis is measured in a logarithmic scale, And on the vertical axis, we'll look at the increasing levels of PFC domination over the rest of human consciousness. So the first inflection point occurred with the evolution of Homo sapiens around 250,000 years ago, with the beginnings of a primitive form of language. Then, around 50,000 years ago, we see some stirrings of the PFC's power with the first cave paintings. It was about 10,000 years ago that the PFC began its ascendancy to power with the rise of agriculture. And then, around 2,000 years ago, a dramatic split took place between the trajectory of Western civilization following the radically dualistic thought of the ancient Greeks and the rest of the world. This divergence became even more pronounced after the scientific revolution, which began in Europe in the 17th century. Now, I'm going to take you through each of these stages in a little more detail, beginning with that ground zero for the PFC's power with the evolution of modern Homo sapiens. Now, over the past few decades, anthropologists and archaeologists have begun to recognize the central role of the PFC in human evolution. They've come to realize that the PFC first developed its unique powers as the engine of our social brain that we needed to get ahead in increasingly large and complex groups. We developed what's known as theory of mind, the ability to infer the mental states of others, to see others as having agency, just like we do. And we developed a narrative self-awareness, the ability to see our past and even our future as a story. The unique connectivity of the PFC allowed us to combine skills from separate domains into an integrated, fluid cognition, leading to the use of symbols, and ultimately, through weaving a net of symbols together, to language. Then, around 50,000 years ago, a revolution in symbolic thought occurred. Our ancestors began using complex tools, music, sewing, ceramic kilns, and engaging in long-distance trade. And they left behind haunting examples of their art on cave walls throughout Europe. Their PFC's patterning instinct was trying to make sense of the world around them, leading to the rise of a mythic consciousness. A key element in this was anthropomorphism, which we can understand as an implicitly using that theory of mind and applying it to other non-humans, such as other animals or inanimate objects. Around the world, in hunter-gatherer cultures, shamanism developed, with a key belief that a person's PFC is separate from their body, that it can leave their body as a spirit and then return again. Then, around 10,000 years ago, people began to realize that through the power of their PFC, they could exercise some control over the plants and animals around them, and agriculture emerged. Along with it came notions of property and land ownership, hierarchies, and inequalities. We begin to see emergence of specialized skills, such as writing and craftsmanship. That, by the way, is one of the earliest examples of writing from Mesopotamia. And we see massive organized projects occurring, such as irrigation and temples, and large complex societies with cities and empires. Then, around 500 BC, in ancient Greece, an idea appeared for the first time in human history that there is an abstract and eternal dimension of the universe, which is the ultimate source of value and meaning. And imprisoned in the human body, an immortal soul exists, which through the power of the reason and abstraction of the PFC connects us with this eternal value and meaning. So, remembering our dual human consciousness from before, what the ancient Greeks did was to equate conceptual consciousness with the soul and animate consciousness with the body. And only the soul is connected with the transcendent meaning of the universe, while the body becomes just another part of the material world. This was the PFC's coup, to see itself as the source of the immortal soul, as the connection with the eternal dimension of the universe. This idea became conflated with the unique form of monotheism arising out of the Middle East to create the ultimate coup, with the rise of Christianity, the first systematic dualistic cosmology. Then, in the 17th century in Europe, a scientific revolution erupted to create our modern world. With Descartes, the dualism of the Greeks was transformed into our modern mind-body dualism. Reductionism became the basis for scientific inquiry, and the natural world was seen as a resource for human conquest and domination. In the words of that great prophet of the scientific age, Francis Bacon, we could unite forces against the nature of things to extend the bounds of human empire, establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe, and render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. And we succeeded beyond Bacon's wildest dreams. Here is just one of countless examples of our dramatic success, a graph showing the accuracy of time measurement over history. You'll see that around the time when Bacon lived, Western European clocks could be off by as much as a minute a day and were less accurate than Chinese clocks. Then it all began improving exponentially, so that now we're off by less than 100 millionth of a second a day. This dramatic transformation of technology led to another exponential curve, the rise in the world population of humans, which leads to other, more disturbing exponential curves, such as the unsustainable level of carbon dioxide we're putting out into the atmosphere, causing global climate change. So, how did the PFC's rise get so exponential? The answer lies in the ratcheting effect of culture. If we go back in time to the evolution of early humans, we see that the PFC's evolving patterning instinct led to early symbolic thought, which encouraged increased PFC usage among those early humans, leading eventually to the emergence of language, which caused each individual's PFC to become more networked, both within the brain and with other PFCs in the community, leading to that fixed and powerful network of symbols that comprise a culture, which we can think of as an external PFC. As that external PFC became more complex, it leveraged each individual PFC from infancy to learn how to dominate the animate consciousness within and the natural world without, leading to the ever-increasing exponential impact of technology and our present dynamic. Now, I see our PFC-powered human takeoff as something like a satellite that's been launched with wobbly controls, which can lead to one of only 3 scenarios. We could leave the Earth behind, which some people talk about in terms of the so-called singularity, the moment when computers become even more intelligent than humans. Essentially, the PFC evolving itself completely away from its human origins. Or, and what many people see as more likely, we could crash and burn as we relentlessly use the Earth's dwindling resources to fuel our exponential growth. Or we could somehow find ourselves in a stable, sustainable orbit. Now, I suspect that most of you, just like me, would prefer this scenario. But how do we get there? Sustainability requires a new inflection point to a PFC 5. But what would that stage of human development look like in terms of the PFC's relation to the rest of human consciousness? How do we get from a tyranny to a democracy of consciousness? A PFC 5 worldview needs to restore integration to the separations of our PFC 4 worldview. Separations within the self, separations in our cosmos, and separations between ourselves and the universe. Now, the spiritual traditions of Asia offer techniques to reduce this PFC tyranny. Zen koans bypass the reasoning mechanism. Buddhism questions the PFC's fixed notion of self. Meditation quiets the PFC's incessant patterning drive. And Taoist Wu Wei offers a mode of non-purposive, non-goal-oriented actions. But it's in modern science that we can find hints of a true PFC 5 worldview. Findings in systems biology and complexity science invalidate that PFC 4 reductionist cosmology. We learn that all living entities are complex, self-organized, dynamical systems. That interactions between things are more important than the things themselves. That no system is autonomous, but continually interacting with other systems. There are no fixed equilibria, only continually shifting states of relative stability, leading to occasional phase transitions and the emergence of new forms of complexity. In a PFC 5 worldview, the explanatory principle of life is not mechanical reductionism, but self-organization and emergence. The relation between the material and spiritual is defined not by dualism, but by integrated dynamics. And the source of spiritual value and meaning is not transcendence, but the dynamic connectivity between all living things. So the human relationship to the natural world goes from being one of domination to one of guidance, sustainability, and mutual support. And what the natural world means to us is no longer a resource to utilize, but a source of material and spiritual nourishment. So the self goes from being seen as a separate, fixed, autonomous entity to something connected, fluid, and interactive. And the PFC goes from being a tyrant in consciousness to becoming a conductor, an observer, a guide. It all begins with recognizing the tyranny of the PFC in our current worldview and the intention to move towards that democracy of consciousness. So when we learn to use our PFC to harmonize ourselves from within, then we can begin to truly harmonize with the world around us. So for anyone interested, I'm writing a book on this subject called Leology, Towards an Integration of Science and Meaning, which goes into more depth on that PFC tyranny and the opportunities of that PFC 5 worldview. You can check my progress on these blogs or contact me for more information. Okay, thank you.